Greetings, everyone, and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Kais. I want to thank you for joining me on the Truth Be Told radio network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, I'm going to dive right into things today, and I want to let you know that if you happen to be watching this on social media and you happen to notice that the title of the episode is labeled "What is Christmas?" I want you to stick with me for a minute because I'm going to explain why I titled today's episode "What is Christmas?" because that appears to be a relatively generic question, and actually I'm asking it with a twist, and therefore I've got to explain what that twist is in order for you to get the joke. It's an inside joke, and I want you to play along with me. So you got to bear with me for just a minute so that I can tell you what the inside joke is. So the title of today's show is "What is Christmas?" Okay, what is Christmas? And I'm going to explain that in just a minute. But before I do, got to do what we always do on social media. If you like this kind of content, would you please like, follow, and subscribe on whatever social media platforms you enjoy? That will help us help you. That will help us continue to provide content like this. Those of you, our listeners and watchers who enjoy God Save the King and enjoy the Truth Be Told radio network. Now, if you like a video format, our preferred platform is Rumble. So if you would like, follow and subscribe us on Rumble, that would be awesome. You can also get God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network as a podcast. So you can go to the Truth Be Told radio network website, click on the podcast tab, and then you will see, it'll take you to the page where you will see the icons for the major podcast platforms that we are on. I think we're up to 15 now, major key word there, up to 15 major podcast platforms where you can find the Truth Be Told radio network and therefore God Save the King. So that's if you like a podcast format, then you can just subscribe to that and get the podcast delivered to your phone or smart device or however it is you prefer to do it. And then finally, if you prefer like a straight audio, or in other words, a radio format, it is after all called the Truth Be Told radio network, even though in our digital age, that doesn't mean what it used to, right? If you prefer a straight audio format, a radio format, simply go to www.truthbetoldnetwork.org and simply click on the Listen Live button, and you will be able to partake of the Truth Be Told radio network. And then finally, last but not least, there are your smart devices, your phones, your in-home, your Google, your Apple smart devices, where all you have to do is speak the command. And I'm not going to do it because my phone's sitting right here. And if I say, hey, you know what, my phone's going to try to respond. So we won't do that on camera. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, social media. It is what it is. Please help us continue to provide the content that you enjoy on God Save the King and on the Truth Be Told radio network. So let's get into today's subject matter. What is Christmas? And what do I mean? Because that, like I said, that's a really generic question, right? So what do I mean by that? What do I mean, what is Christmas? And what I'm going to introduce you to here is I'm going to introduce you to a concept that I think we're going to use quite a bit going forward in God Save the King. So if you just so happen to be a new listener to God Save the King, let me just take just a minute and explain what God Save the King is. God Save the King is a Bible teaching show. We talk about the Bible. I teach the Bible. I talk about the Bible like crazy on God Save the King. But in particular, I talk about the nativity. And the reason I talk about the nativity is because I discovered about 40 years ago that Jesus could not have been born on December 25th. So I began what has now turned into a 40-year research project to discover what the nativity really would have looked like. And if you haven't heard my show before, if you've never heard this before, what that means is the traditional nativity story that we are used to hearing, frankly and unfortunately, isn't really how the nativity would have looked. And therefore, that's my objective. And that's what we're going to talk about today. My objective is, okay, what would it really have looked like? There it is. What would it really have looked like? And if you watch any documentary on media, right? And that means whether you're going to the History Channel, or it used to be A&E was the big one. I'm assuming that's still out there. Or if you go to Netflix, or you go to YouTube or Rumble or whoever, and you watch a documentary, a lot of them, not all of them, of course, but a lot of them, especially if it's a documentary about an historical event or an historical person, it is very common within the first 5 to 10 minutes that you'll hear the MC, right, say something to the effect of, pardon me, we're used to hearing the legend, and the legend goes something like this, ABC, right? But the truth actually looks more like this, XYZ, right? So that could be, and I've used these examples a lot, you could pick a character from American history that has a myth that surrounds him. So if you look at, Daniel Boone or Davy Crockett or Wyatt Earp, right? They all have these legends that surround them, right? So it'd be very interesting to take a much closer look at, are the legends really true, and what would their life really have looked like? And then certainly in Europe, you've got this going on. So whether you're talking about King Arthur or Robin Hood or Ragnar Lothbrok or Charlemagne or any of these guys, right? Any of the Merovingian kings, there is undoubtedly legend that surrounds them. So what's the truth? What does the truth really look like? And certainly, and just to round it out, right? I don't want to sound like this is all about Western culture. I'm sure you've got it in Eastern culture too. You could go to ancient Japan and look up Miyamoto Musashi, or you could go to Central Asia and look up, Genghis Khan or any of the Mongols that, ran this massive empire in Central Asia, and discover that there are legends about these guys that are not necessarily what it really truly would have looked like. Okay. So all of that is applicable here. Did the nativity look like the tradition, or did it look differently? And the reason we're doing this is because this helps us do better Bible study overall, because at the end of the day, I am a follower of Jesus Christ. Okay. I am a believer. I am a quote unquote Christian, right? And I want to follow Jesus more closely. So how do I do that other than learn more about him from the Bible and from history, so that I quote unquote know him better, right? How do I know him better than to continue to seek and to study and to ask? Scripture says, knock and the door will be opened unto you. So I'm knocking. All right. I am knocking. But what this boils down to, and here we go. So let's explain this title. Why am I calling it What is Christmas? Right. So here you go. The Bible is an ancient book. See, and this dovetails into what we talked about last week, because last week the show was entitled, What is Second Temple Judaism and Why Does It Matter? Well, here we go again. So this is a brief summary of last week, dovetailing into what we're going to talk about this week, and frankly, why it matters. Why does it matter, right? Because the Bible is an ancient book. The Bible is an ancient book. It is a minimum of almost 2,000 years old for the New Testament, and probably more like 3 to 3,500 years old for the Old Testament. It is an ancient book. Okay. And it was written by an ancient author for an ancient target audience, and that's not us. Okay? Likewise, the Bible is a foreign book. It was written by a foreign author to a foreign target audience that is not us, right? So when you put that together, of course, you get that the Bible is an ancient foreign book with an ancient foreign author and an ancient foreign target audience, none of whom are you and me, right? We are not the primary audience of the Bible, okay? So the Bible may have been written for us, but it was not written to us. We are not the primary audience. So these are challenges and obstacles that we must overcome if we are to read and understand the Bible and then interpret and apply it correctly. We've got to, in effect, get into the head of the ancient foreign author and the ancient foreign audience to discover what was the message that he was trying to convey. What was he writing? Because he's writing for a reason. Authors do not write for just no reason whatsoever. And authors do not write so that the audience can just make up a meaning. There's something that they are, and even if it's just a story, even if all it is to entertain, that author still has a purpose. See, I want to turn this into a book. So I'm reading books about writing books, right? So one of the things you learn as an author trying to write is who is your target audience. See, and if you're listening to my show, chances are you're part of my target audience. See, so I've got to ask questions about who is going to read the book that I write, because not just anybody is going to read this book. And if I try to make it for everybody, see, this is what you learn in these kind of books. If I try to make my book for everybody, it probably won't work that well. But if I find a target audience and I say, well, it's probably people who are familiar with the Bible, right? Now, that doesn't mean someone who is unfamiliar couldn't understand it, but they may not necessarily be my target audience, but maybe they are, right? Hard to say, because I do want to write the book in such a way that if you understand the Bible, it's going to be easier to understand my point. And that I also want to write it in such a way that if you're not familiar with the Bible, that you're not lost, right? You're see, so you got to think. So this is what's going on. This is the equation that's going on, is that we need to, in effect, try to time travel back to the day and time when the book was written, and get into the head of the author and or the audience to understand what they were thinking, and therefore trying to understand the story, the text that was written. So that's what we're going to do. And so after I was working on this, and after I posted the graphic about today's show, I got to thinking about it, and I probably should have called this the time travel game, because that's what we're going to do today. Is we are going to engage in the time travel game. And this is probably something we're going to do frequently going forward in other episodes, as I'm going to reference this and I'm going to say, let's play the time travel game. So now, what is the time travel game? Well, here it is. It's got a couple of different versions, so let me explain. Time travel game number one is, I want you to imagine, it's a mental exercise, right? It's a thought experiment. I want you to imagine that you time travel back to the 1st century AD, right? Now you can put or 1st century BC for that matter. What I want you to do is here you go, tying it into last week, right? Imagine time traveling back to the Second Temple era. The Second Temple era. That means the time of Herod's temple. The original temple had been destroyed. It was then rebuilt after the captivity by Zerubbabel, and then remodeled extensively by Herod, right? And Herod's temple, by the way, was more magnificent than Solomon's temple, Okay, so that's part of the understanding, is that you've got this glorious temple in Jerusalem, right? And then you've got all this historical background that I talk about extensively on my show and on my website. So if you want to understand the Second Temple era, dive into archived episodes of my show, dive into the articles on my website to help you understand the Second Temple era. Who were the Maccabees? Who were the Hasmoneans? Two words for kind of the same thing, but not exactly. There's actually a distinction between the Hasmoneans and the Maccabees. Kind of the same thing, but not, right? Who are they? Who are the Herodians? Who was Herod? What was Herod's family like? Who was his father? Who were his children? Who were his wives? What were they like? What other historical characters are part of the story, right? Because Judea was a client under Herod, was a client kingdom of the Roman Empire. Well, what Romans were involved? Was Julius Caesar involved? What about Augustus Caesar? Augustus Caesar is mentioned in the Bible. Okay. What about the Parthian Empire? This is a huge part of what I talk about on God Save the King, because we're not taught anything about the Parthian Empire in school. I never heard of the Parthian Empire ever until I started studying the Bible in depth. And if you don't know, the Parthian Empire is the superpower to the east of Israel, or Judea, right? And why do I call it Judea? Well, that would have been the name that was used at the time. It really wouldn't have probably been called Israel at that time. It would have been known as the Roman client kingdom of Judea, okay? Which is a derivation of the Hebrew name Judah, from the tribe of Judah, and the southern kingdom, okay, that would have been called the kingdom of Judah, right? So the name morphed a little bit as it got translated from Hebrew into Greek, and then into Latin, and then finally into English, where we would call it Judea. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's simply the same name in a different language. And see, that's going to come up later. That's going to come up as part of the time travel game. So here, once again, is the time travel game. I want you to imagine, thought experiment, I want you to imagine time traveling back to the Second Temple era. Okay? And let's imagine that it is when Jesus is in his earthly ministry. So you could time travel in your head back to a time when you could actually ask Jesus questions, right? Or you can select a time frame later, which for our purposes, I think is a little better, right? Not that you can't time travel back and imagine Jesus. That's a good idea. But I want you to consider this possibility. Time travel back to 40, 45, 50, 55 AD. Jesus has died, resurrected, and ascended. And now you've got the disciples and the followers of Christ trying to go do what Jesus told them to go do, to begin to, quote unquote, spread the gospel. Judea, Samaria, the uttermost parts of the earth. So they're these men and women, it's the book of Acts, right? And read what these men and women started to do. What did Peter do? And then Paul comes on the scene. What did Paul do? So I want you to imagine time traveling back to this day and time. And I suggest you can pick your own biblical character, but I'm going to suggest one of a handful, and then I'm going to actually suggest one of two for our purposes. You can modify this as necessary. Select a biblical character: Jesus, Joseph, his father, his adopted father, right? Jesus, Joseph, Mary, right? Or my recommendation, Matthew or Luke. Now, the reason I'm going to suggest Matthew or Luke is because they were the writers of the Gospels that include infancy narratives. Mark doesn't include an infancy narrative. John does not include an infancy narrative. Matthew and Luke do. And since our focus is the nativity, the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, and those are the two writers that wrote about it, then hence the thought experiment says, okay, I want you to go back, time travel backwards in your head, and you have an opportunity to interview Matthew, or you have an opportunity to interview Luke, right? So once you get past the basics, and you get them to realize what you're doing, you have politely persuaded them to allow them to be interviewed, then you start getting down to the nitty gritty and you start asking questions, right? Now, before we get into the questions, I need to cover a caveat, because this is part of what I'm explaining. I'm doing all of this to illustrate a point. That's why we are engaging in the time travel thought experiment, is to illustrate certain ideas and to, frankly, stimulate creative thinking, right? I want to stimulate creative thinking and get you asking questions and imagining what this would have looked like. So therefore, once again, the time travel experiment, okay, the time travel thought experiment. So, but here is a disclaimer that needs to be part of the equation. As I have already said, the Bible is an ancient book. The Bible is a foreign book. It's an ancient foreign book. And we are not the target audience, right? Okay. So that means, of necessity, the Bible has to have been translated from its original language into our language. Now, that is a problem all by itself, because it is not uncommon in the field of translation for the new language. Okay. So now, if English becomes the target language and the original language was Hebrew or Aramaic or Greek, right? But then English becomes the target language. Does English even have the equivalent word? Because oftentimes we do not. So that right there can be a problem, is that the target language may or may not even have the equivalent word at all, right? So that's when you start getting loan words. So loan words are words that make the journey from one language, frankly, into another, okay? And sometimes they hardly change at all, right? I put up a little post the other day about a particular Greek word that basically has been transmitted into English without it being changed. The spelling changed a tiny little bit, but other than that, the word is basically the same. It's clearly a loan word, right? And then ironically, the loan word is used in medicine in the Western, according to Western medicine, right? And interestingly enough, the medical term retains what the word really means extremely well. Looking at the medical term helps you go, oh, wow, that's what that word means. And because it's because it's a loan word in the target language, that is an example of a good way of transposing it backwards into the ancient culture and being able to go, oh, I can see how that works. I can see how that works, right? But my point here is, number one, does the target language even have the words, right? Okay. Number two, even if it has the words, do those words accurately convey the idea? Because once again, the idea is from a foreign culture thousands of years ago. So the concept may be that it's trying to communicate may be entirely different, right? So does the word even exist? And then two, if it does, is the concept the same? Because the concept may not be the same. I'm reading another book right now where we're talking about the law of Moses, and the author is demonstrating the fact that the word law today has a very different meaning than it did 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. See, and we think because it's been translated into the word law, right? See, that would be the Hebrew word Torah, right? The Hebrew word Torah really means instruction, not law, right? So this is what we're talking about here, is that how do we grasp ideas that are foreign and ancient compared to us. When the book is not written to us, it's written, maybe written for us, but it's not written to us. Okay? And this comes from John Walton, by the way. I'm referencing his book, The Lost World of Torah. I've read his book, The Lost World of Adam and Eve. He's got tremendous insights. That saying, not written to us, but it is written for us, that's from John Walton. So if you want to check out his books, give credit where credit is due. That's where a lot of this is coming from, okay? But what I've discovered, what John Walton has helped me discover, is that I actually already know this, and I've already been doing it in God Save the King for a long time. He is helping me articulate it better. So hopefully you guys, my listening audience, my viewing audience, is listening to this, watching this, and hearing me say this, and the light bulb is coming on for you the same way it's coming on for me, that the aha moments are popping up going, oh, wow, okay, I see that in a way I didn't see it before, right? So here you go. The thought experiment is you have time traveled back to, let's say, 50 AD, and you are hanging out with, let's pick a name, Matthew, right? And you have managed, and the language, the translation thing, like I just said, for the sake of argument and for the sake of playing the game, let's assume that that's just on the back burner for a minute, right? That the translation issue is not the issue, right? The concept issue may be, right? The idea issue is frankly what we're driving at, but the technical translational issue is not a thing right now, right? Okay. So it's 50 AD. You're hanging out with Matthew. Matthew has agreed to be interviewed. You've convinced him that you're a time traveler from the future and that you've time traveled back 2,000 years and that you want to interview him, right? Because you were an eyewitness to Jesus's ministry. So can I interview you? And he says, sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And then he says, what do you want to talk about? And here you go. Here you go. All of that explanation to get to this point, but now you're going to understand. So you're hanging out with Matthew. He's agreed to be interviewed. And he says, well, what do you want to talk about? And you say, I want to ask you questions about the first Christmas. And Matthew gets a puzzled look on his face, and he looks back at you and he asks the question, what's Christmas? What is Christmas? I have no idea what you're talking about. That is why I titled today's episode, What is Christmas? Because, what's the word I want to use here? The inflection matters. How you say it matters. It's not what is Christmas. That's not the question. The question is, as if Matthew or Luke or John or James or Mary or Joseph or even Jesus himself, if you time traveled back in time and you said, hey, I want to ask you some questions about the first Christmas, they would all look at you going, the what? The what? The first what? The first Christmas? And you say, well, yeah, about the birth of Jesus. And they go, oh, so you want to ask us questions about the birth of Jesus? Yes, I do. But what did you call it? You called it the first what? The first Christmas. Like I said, once again, they're going to look at you and they're going to go, the what? What do you see? Because that word means nothing to them. And this is a classic example. This is a classic example of us taking a modern concept and transposing it backwards 2,000 years and trying to understand an ancient foreign idea looking through a colored viewfinder. That viewfinder has a particular color to it, and you're looking through it, and as a result, everything's going to have that color, right? So because of my research, obviously, you can see behind me here, right? That's, a very small portion of the books that I consult, a very small portion, right? I have dozens and dozens and dozens of books, if not hundreds, frankly, about the Second Temple era. lots of them, to help me understand what's going on and how to how to historically portray what the Second Temple era would have been like, and therefore what Joseph and Mary's life would have been like, and therefore what the birth of Jesus would have actually looked like, right? Well, the reason I mentioned this is one of them is called The First Christmas, air quotes, right? Okay, and I bought the book. Don't get me wrong. I bought the book hoping that the author would have some clever insights. But at the same time, I'm buying the book and going, First Christmas, this guy clearly can't know what he's talking about, right? If he's calling it the First Christmas, you got a problem, right? And there you go. Like all the research books I have, how many of them acknowledge that Jesus wasn't born on December 25th? Because if you still think he was, then that again is coloring your thinking. Whether you realize it or not, it's going to color your thinking. Now, thankfully, that's one that doesn't hit very often, but it still does. Still does. I had a incident a little while ago where it was indirect. It didn't happen to me. It happened to a friend of mine who doesn't believe that Jesus was born on December 25th and was sharing the information with someone else. And this person had a problem with that, right? And here's my friend telling me about it and saying, yeah, this person was like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? Of course he was born on December 25th, right? And my friend's like, yeah, no, he wasn't, So thankfully, that's not really an issue anymore, but there it is, right? That is looking backwards through December 25th is looking backwards through a colored viewfinder. The traditional nativity story is looking backwards through a colored viewfinder. Three wise men is looking backwards through a colored viewfinder, right? See, here you go. This is the time travel thought experiment that I want you guys to play. So the first version of the time travel thought experiment is that you actually get to go back to the first century and you get to interview Matthew or Luke and you get to ask them, what did this look like, right? Or potentially Joseph or Mary or Jesus, right? What did this look like? See, now the reason maybe don't have it be Jesus is because if you do, then you've got to think of Jesus, the accurate Jesus, right? And then you have the whole issue of he's God incarnate, right? He gets revelation, amazingly, right? So his perspective may have been different based upon the revelation, right? Not as simply another human observer at that time, which is what I'm driving at, see? And likewise, see, we don't know that Matthew or Luke were eyewitnesses to the nativity, but what we can do is we can establish through scripture that it is highly probable that both Matthew and Luke knew Mary personally, and that therefore they're an eyewitness to Mary, right? So therefore their account is based upon her testimony of what happened. But you got to be cautious there as well. It was a reason I don't necessarily recommend having this person be Mary, is because you've got to cut through the colored viewfinder about Mary, because there is an enormously tainted viewfinder that looks backward at Mary and makes her into something she was not. So that's an area where you have to be very careful as well. But this is the equation, ladies and gentlemen. This is the equation. The time travel thought experiment is, can you take yourself backwards and go, all right, what did this look like? What did it look like? What did it sound like? What did it smell like? What was the language? What were the people like? What were their cultural illusions? See, we talked about that last week. We have cultural illusions, right? We can throw around terminology that we understand, that if I'm writing a book and you are my modern target audience, and we did this last week, and I mention Watergate, or I say Grand Slam, or I say Google, right? Those things all mean something to the modern audience that understands the cultural illusion. You know what Watergate is, right? You know what a Grand Slam is. You know what Google is. But you don't have to go backwards very far at all to where people would not understand that at all. So here's a thought experiment, right? So here we go. Let's play the game. Let's have some fun. So the second version of the time travel thought experiment is you get to go to a different place and time, and you get to take your Bible friend with you, right? So now it's you and Luke, or you and Matthew, time traveling together to a particular place and time, and then witnessing a certain event. Okay? And that the two of you get to talk to, or hang out with, or interview a certain person at that time. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select certain people that have influenced the nativity story. That's what I'm doing here, right? So now the time travel thought experiment becomes me and you and Matthew and Luke are time traveling to a specific place and date to meet a certain person or witness a certain event. And then we're going to talk to the people and go, and we get to ask questions. How did you come to the conclusion to do what you did, right? Because these are going to be people that affected the nativity story, right? Because back to the foundational premise is that the traditional nativity story, the one that we are used to, it has developed over time. It's not the original story, and it changed and developed a little by 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 little to the story that it is today. And that the story is today, it's the historical version of the telephone game, right? The children's game, right, where they whisper a sentence to each other as they go around a circle, and that sentence changes until it gets back to the original, and then the last person tells the original, and they're like, "What?" Okay, that's exactly what we're talking about here. So here's the time travel thought experiment. Let's do this. Let's go, right? So you, me, Matthew, Luke, or whatever, we are time traveling backwards to 1857. Okay, so for us, it's not all that long. It's 170 years, 175 years, right? To the city of New York in the United States of America, right? So it's 1857. It's New York. It's the United States. This is pre-Civil War. Pre-Civil War. Interesting, right? Very, 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 very interesting. Pre-Civil War. And we are traveling backwards to, like I said, we're going to New York, and we are going to the General Theological Seminary in New York City. Now, the General Theological Seminary is an Episcopal theological seminary that was founded in 1817. So it's been around for about 40 years at this point. It is part of the Episcopal Church in the United States, and it is their theological, at this time, and still, I think it's still there today, believe it or not. I'm not sure. I'd have to check that. But at that time, it was one of the oldest theological seminaries in the United States, right? Now, because obviously, like Princeton is, that one goes way back. Harvard originally started as a seminary as well, right? Anyway, so misspoke. the Episcopal General Theological Seminary in New York City, founded in 1817. Now we have time traveled back to 1857, and we are going to meet a man whose name is John Henry Hopkins, right? And the reason we're going to meet John Henry Hopkins is because he is playing a vital role in the seasonal nativity play that is going on at the General Theological Seminary, right? So this is interesting, right? Play along. This is kind of fun. So you got to do this, like I said, thought experiment in your head. We're going back 170 years or so to mid 19th century United States, city of New York. An Episcopal Theological Seminary are doing their annual, here you go, Christmas play, their annual nativity play. And we are interviewing John Henry Hopkins. And what we are going to do is we are going to interview John Henry Hopkins because we are going to ask him about this new song that he has just written for the nativity play. And this song is called We Three Kings of Orient Are. Okay? So this is the story behind the We Three Kings of Orient Are Christmas carol that is now super popular today. It is probably the most popular American written Christmas carol, right? Or definitely one of the top 5, even 3, right? But here you go. We Three Kings of Orient Are was written by John Henry Hopkins, who was actually a pastor of a church in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, right? And that he had traveled to New York for their annual nativity play, and he had written this new song, right? But I want you to think about this because this is a very commonly known Christmas carol. We Three Kings of Orient Are, bearing gifts we traverse afar, field and fountain, moor and mountain, following yonder star, right? Oh, star of wonder, star of night, star of royal beauty, bright, westward leading, still proceeding, guide us to thy perfect light, right? And we hardly ever sing past the first verse and stanza, but here's what's not known about this Christmas carol, right? John Henry Hopkins wrote it in such a way that it is frankly supposed to be the 3 wise men singing one each of the next 3 verses, right? So when you get to the next verse, it's supposed to be the wise man, one of them, right, whose name is Gaspar, right? And he sings the next verse where he talks about the gift that he brings, which is gold. Okay. Then when you get to the next verse, that is the wise man whose name is Melchior. And he is talking about the gift that he is bringing, which is frankincense. And then when you get to the next verse, this is supposedly being sung by the third wise man whose name was Balthazar, and the gift that he was bringing, which was myrrh. Okay. So track with me here, right? John Henry Hopkins has written a song about the 3 kings, the 3 wise men who have come from their foreign country to Bethlehem to bring these gifts to the king, right? And that he wrote it in such a fashion that the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th verse are supposed to be each one of the 3 wise men, Gaspar, Melchior, or Balthazar, speaking or singing about the particular gift that they brought. Gaspar, gold, Melchior, frankincense, Balthazar, myrrh. Okay. So now we get to interview John Henry Hopkins, and we have, here's the point, you've got Matthew or Luke with you, right? And we have just watched the nativity play, right, at the General Theological Seminary in New York in 1857, and we have just heard for the first time ever this brand new Christmas song, We Three Kings of Orient Are. Okay. Now, before I go any further, I need to make another caveat right here. In no way, shape, or form am I doing this to be pejorative. Absolutely not, right? We have every reason to believe that John Henry Hopkins and the congregation at the General Theological Seminary on that night, that they love God, they love Jesus, and they're doing their best to follow Jesus according to their understanding. So in no way, shape, or form am I doing this to be pejorative, right? I'm just not, okay? But I want you to play along with the thought experiment. And if the thought experiment is that you and me and Matthew and Luke have landed at this nativity play at the General Theological Seminary of the Episcopal Church in New York City in December of 1857, and we've watched the nativity play and we've heard that Christmas carol, what are Matthew and Luke going to think and ask John Henry Hopkins? What are they going to say? What are they going to say? What do they think? What are they going to do? Is what here, and here you go. Is what they're seeing familiar to them? Does it resonate? Is it accurate? Do they understand? Or, frankly, what is the possibility? And frankly, I think it's a very real possibility that Matthew or Luke would turn to you during the presentation, which they would, look, smart men, they would figure out by the end of the nativity play that, well, that's Mary, that's Jesus, that's Joseph. Those are supposed to be the Magi, right? They would be able to figure that out. They're not dumb, right? But what's the likelihood that they're going to turn to you and go, what are we watching? What is this? Okay, this is evidently supposed to be the birth of Jesus, but would they recognize it? And here's the real point, right? And like I said, I in no way, shape, or form is this intended to be offensive, accusatory, against John Henry Hopkins and We Three Kings or the Episcopal Church or any of that, or any of us, frankly, that love the Christmas Carol, right? We Three Kings. We Three Kings of Orient, right? Like I said, in no way, shape, or form is this intended to be judgmental or accusatory or, like I keep saying, pejorative, right? But now the nativity play is over and we're going to hang out with John Henry Hopkins and talk about their nativity play. What are Matthew and Luke going to say? How are they going to act? What questions are they going to ask? What questions am I going to ask? What do you get to learn about this? Where did you get their names? The wise, there's three wise men. Were there three? Because now John Henry Hopkins gets to turn to Matthew and say, well, that's the tradition. Is it right? Is it correct? Were there three? Right? Were there three? Right? See, because my research tends to indicate thousands. That an army showed up, not three guys on camels. Stinking army showed up, right? So asking questions like, well, where'd you get their names? Gaspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, right? Now there's variations on those. By the way, Gaspar is also known as Casper, right? And there's variations on Balthazar as well, right? But it'd be interesting to see the questions because once again, this is all about how tradition develops over time, right? Tradition develops over time, and it's the children's it's the adult version of the children's telephone game where it changes a little each time it gets transmitted. It changes a little until by the time you've gone around the circle, the message bears no resemblance to what it did originally. Oh, interesting. right? See, so likewise, we could play the same game to go and to another historical occasion, right? And this historical occasion would be, okay, I want you to, we're going to go backwards in time, and we're going to go to Europe. We're going to go to Italy, okay? And we're going to go to a town called Greccio, right? Now, I don't even know where Greccio is. I don't know if it's in northern Italy, central Italy, southern Italy. I didn't take the time to look that up. But we are going to the city of Greccio in Italy in 1223, okay? And there's a reason that maybe you know it, maybe you don't. But of course, I'm going to tell you in just a second. But it's the same thought experiment, right? It's you, me, Matthew, and Luke going to Greccio, Italy in 1223. And what's the event? Well, the event is another nativity play, okay? So nativity plays have been around for a minute, okay? But this occasion marks a very significant change in the nativity play. That prior to this date, nativity plays tended to look a certain way. Now, after this, nativity plays are going to tend to look a different way. And due to this change, the celebration or the practice of nativity plays exploded through Europe because of this event, right? So this is very interesting, once again, to continue to play the time travel thought experiment game of trying to transport ourselves to this day and this time and see what we're seeing and ask questions. And frankly, like I said, take Matthew or Luke with you. They get to ask questions too, and people to get to ask questions of them. Okay, so what is this event? Well, this event, to the best of our understanding, is the first time that anyone presented a live nativity play with live actors and animals and a doll for the baby Jesus, right? But that was not in the church, not performed by the priests only, and delivered in the language of the people. Okay. See, because like I said, prior to this, nativity plays looked a certain way. And after this, nativity plays tended to look a certain way. And this event was the event that changed it. So this was the first ever live nativity play with actors and animals that was outside, not actually in the church, not performed by the priests only, and not in Latin, in the language of the people present. And this was done by Francesco of Assisi, right? Who we would know as Saint Francis of Assisi, right? Very, very interesting. The first ever quote unquote live nativity play, but with actors and animals and stuff like that. Okay. And like I said, as a result of this particular nativity play, the practice of nativity plays went outside the actual church. See, prior to that, like I said, I'm repeating myself, nativity plays existed, but it was always performed by the priest in the sanctuary of the church and always in Latin. Okay. So now it's not the priest, it's outside, it's to the public, it's by, to, and for the public. And Francis of Assisi is the guy who did this. And as a result, the popularity of this style of nativity play exploded through Europe over the next 100 years. Just went crazy. Okay. But once again, providing for the language barrier, right? Now, you, me, Matthew, and Luke get to meet with Francis, and we get to talk about the nativity play. What is that conversation going to look like, right? Because you've got Matthew and Mark who know what it looked like to talk to now. So what are the questions that are going to go back and forth between you and me and Francis about his nativity play. And for example, St. Francis did it in a cave, right? And that is because there's a very strong tradition that Jesus was born in a cave. Now, I don't believe that. I do not believe that is what Scripture reveals, and I don't believe that that part of the tradition actually wound up being correct. I believe that Jesus was born in a traditional Judean home based upon the architecture of the time and where the animals would be kept, and therefore where the manger would be, because we know he was laid in a manger. That we know, right? See, and once again, as part of this picture, we got to remember that we need to read very carefully what the text does and does not say. So see, I've pointed out in the past that the Bible does not say that he was born in a cave or that he was born in a stable. It only says he was laid in a manger, and that is not the same thing. Okay, so now, ladies and gentlemen, we are actually out of time. So I do need to wrap this up. I got a few more seconds here to wrap this up, but what a great concept. A time travel thought experiment where you can engage in conversation with not only biblical characters, but the people who were responsible for the development of the tradition over time. And therefore, you get to ask them, okay, where did you learn this? How do you know that this is true? How do you know there were three wise men? How do you know these were their names, etc., etc.? But we're going to talk about this. We're going to use this much more going forward in the future. So, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Tim Keyes. You have been listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. God save the King.